Subcommittee on Disaster Recovery. My ranking member was planning to join us and was called away to the White House for an unexpected meeting. So Senator Graham will not be with us today, but his staff is here and other members may come in. We've called this meeting today to discuss the ongoing efforts of the federal government to better coordinate the case management work associated with disasters, particularly catastrophic disasters, as was the case in the 2005 season with Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and then followed on by Gustav and Ike, which really devastated the Gulf Coast. It's not the first time we've had a catastrophic natural disaster in the country, but it was one of the most significant and, of course, most recent. So let me first begin by welcoming our panel. I'm going to give a very brief opening remark and then introduce our first panel. We have then a second panel. Before I do, there are a few announcements. I'm pleased to have three Louisiana legislators with us. If you all would stand and let me recognize you all. We're always pleased to have legislators from any state, but particularly my state, so welcome. And I understand it's Beth Zimmerman's birthday today. So happy birthday, Beth. Working on her birthday. These FEMA people, they just keep working. So we appreciate you being here on your special day. Let me just begin by saying that in the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, 250,000 families lost their homes. So over a weekend, they were homeless. 240,000 people lost their jobs. Over a weekend, 240,000 people became unemployed. Schools, hospitals, and transportation systems ceased to operate. So did social support networks that we all count on when those things happen, like churches, community centers, nonprofits were unable to reopen. All of this upheaval took a massive toll on the physical, mental, and emotional and financial well-being of people along the Gulf Coast. In response to these complex and overwhelming needs, disaster relief nonprofits and government agencies hurriedly launched a series of ad hoc case management programs to help families get back on their feet because, frankly, we didn't have anything very well organized before this. The overarching objective of case management, as we know, was to return households to a state of normalcy and self-sufficiency as soon as possible. Case managers are supposed to serve as a single point of contact to help survivors access resources and services. Resources include things, as we know, like furniture, cookware, clothing, or housing, and services might be jobs, job placement, job training, child care, mental health counseling, financial counseling, or transportation to school and work, anything that would help this family been displaced get back to normal. FEMA, HUD, HHS, the states of Louisiana and Mississippi have all run case management programs since the 2005 hurricanes. The existence of so many programs in the same region caused a great deal of confusion among service providers and clients, but it also provided a diverse set of examples to inform the development of better models for the future. That's what this hearing is about today. It's called the Comprehensive National Program Focused on Outcomes. We're hoping that the information that is given can provide a more comprehensive approach focused not on process, but on outcomes, positive outcomes for these families in the event that this happens again, and undoubtedly it will someplace, somewhere in the United States, something similar. So several startling statistics I just want to raise as we open this hearing. At one point, and I'm not sure of the date of this, but at one point, sometime probably within a few months of the storm, maybe within a year, a survey was taken, and we found that only 1/3 of school-aged children at a group trailer site known as Renaissance Village in Baker, Louisiana, of which many of us are very, very, very familiar with, were attending school. That is not a good signal. The homeless population of New Orleans, our understanding is, has doubled since these storms, although great efforts have been made and a Herculean effort has been made, not only by our local groups, but HUD, to try to find appropriate housing. There's still thousands of people that the coalition believes are still homeless, living in abandoned or vacant homes. Case managers and their clients use separate programs with different eligibility rules. We'll learn more about that today. As a result, clients went through intake multiple times. Providers had to expend significant administrative resources. I could go on and on. Some of the previous pilot programs seemed to focus, as I said, more on process than on outcomes. When they passed a client on to someone else, the case was closed. That doesn't necessarily mean the family was ultimately helped. It's just the case was closed. We want to think about a system where when cases are closed, that means the family's back in a house, back in a job, kids are back in school, the family is back in a self-sufficient manner. And these are families that some were on public assistance, but the majority had never been on public assistance, but most certainly needed some government aid to get them back to a normal state. So we must continue to look at ways to improve, and that's what this hearing is about. Case managers, our understanding from testimony, were required to meet quotas for closing cases, which may have led to premature closures, as I said, or just passing off families that were difficult to serve. Case management services are delivered under difficult conditions that make communication, record-keeping, coordination, and efficiency tough. In areas like Southeast Louisiana, where housing and mental health professionals had all but disappeared, connecting people with the resources and services they needed was at sometimes an impossible task. But we need to understand this happens in a natural disaster. What can we do to improve it? There's always tension between consistency and flexibility. We must standardize things like paper forms, data entry, and funding, but we also need to give flexibility to those trying to deliver these services in a difficult situation. The Privacy Act prohibits FEMA from sharing registrants' information without written consent, so case managers knock on trailer doors and rely on word of mouth to offer their services instead of having some more reliable data. Maybe that's appropriate, maybe it's not. We should review that. That is what I'm hoping that we can get from some of our panelists today. Suggestions as to how we can improve the situation. Let me suggest, though, in closing, that we may not have to look that far, and perhaps some of you have already looked at the international models that exist, that have existed for over 30 or 40 years, that serve to help displaced families. In international circles, they're called refugees, but in the context of our speaking, they share a lot of similarities with people who are displaced inside of America. American citizens are displaced temporarily from their homes, and perhaps we can look at international models that are successful and shape them and modify them so we can be more helpful when thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of families are displaced, not for a day, not for a weekend, not for a week, but for months, and some displaced for years from their homes while the community is trying to reestablish itself. So we're hoping to get some information at this hearing about how to do that, and of course for the taxpayer, picking up the tab for all of this, it's important that we do it efficiently and effectively so we're not wasting resources and wasting funding, and we do it, of course, with respect and appropriate, respect and deference to the families that we are trying to serve and the communities that we're working within. So with that, let me give the rest of my statement to the record and introduce briefly the first panel, and we're very pleased that we had such a good response. And our first witness today, I'm going to introduce you all and then go into your testimony. Again, Beth Zimmerman, our birthday person, who serves as Assistant Administrator for Disaster Assistance at FEMA. She's had extensive state experience, has acted as state coordinating officer for numerous federally declared disasters, as well as scores of state-level disasters. We're looking forward to your testimony on this issue of case management. David Hansel is the Principal Deputy Secretary for the Administration of Children and Families with the Department of Health and Human Services. David, thank you for being here. We're looking forward to your views. Fred Tombar is a senior advisor to Secretary Donovan. He's probably been in New Orleans as many times as I have in the last, and to our state in the last few months, and we appreciate it. Being from the state of Louisiana, he's very special to us, and looking forward to his testimony today. Kay Brown, our fourth witness, is Director of Education, Workforce, and Income Security at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. She will be here to discuss a report that GAO released, which I co-requested with Chairman Lieberman, and will shed some light on this challenge before us. And finally, Amanda Guma is Health and Human Services Policy Director for our own Louisiana Recovery Authority, where she's overseen our case management programs in Louisiana, and so she will be giving somewhat of the state perspective. We've also invited our Mississippi folks to participate as well, and again, we have some of our international agencies that are here won't be testifying to provide any opportunities for input. So, Ms. Zimmerman, why don't we begin with you? And if you could limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and then we'll go for a first round of questioning. Thank you. Thank you very much, particularly for those succinct and I think very excellent recommendations for improvement. Before I get into questions, you all have the charts, I believe, on the table, and I'd just like to refer you to the timeline first. Just to put this hearing in perspective, while we are very encouraged by the agreement, Ms. Zimmerman, between FEMA and the Department of Health and Human Services, we want to recognize by this timeline the fact that actually before Katrina and Rita, there was virtually no, case management provision in the federal law for dealing with a disaster, as if it was not an essential component of recovery, which obviously it is a critical and essential component of recovery. When you see this timeline on this chart, which is represented up here, what strikes me as the hurricane hit in 2005 and the levees broke in August of 2005, Mississippi didn't even have a case management pilot program started until August of 2008. You think about that. 3 years later, until the program was even started, there in, what was phase two in Mississippi. Now, Louisiana Family Recovery Corp started in January of 2006, which is much sooner, but still think about families in September and October and November and December at some of the most critical times in these families' lives, and there wasn't much to reach to. And what was there was little, and if anything, and very fragmented. We don't want to see this happen again. Another very interesting graph from this report, which struck me, is not up on our chart, but you all at the table can see it. It's a graph of how people found out about CAT, Katrina Aid Today, which was the federal program put together in, it looks like here, sometime late in 2005. 85% of the clients, according to the GAO report, heard it from word of mouth. I mean, you would think in the midst of a major disaster, people would be, of course, listening to the radio or listening to public spots on the television. To think that families had to hear it from each other as sort of a circle of survivors, like what's working for you? Well, this case manager helped me, maybe she can help you, is a little bit I mean, it threw me a little bit. I mean, I don't know why we can't get free radio advertisement to tell these families. The other interesting chart, which is going to be part of my questions, because I'm going to ask you about how we're going to set up a system that actually can surge when necessary, is demonstrated by this chart, the greatest number of clients that were served. There were more clients served in Louisiana, thank you for putting that up, 30,000, than all the states combined. So Texas had 13,000 people, Mississippi had 9,000, Alabama, I'm just roughing these, 2,500, Georgia, 2,500. So Louisiana had 30,000 clients that were served. You could argue that 3 times as many people needed the help as ever got it and just abandoned the effort altogether. I don't know if we'll ever know what those numbers were, but even assuming that these were all the families that needed help and we reached everyone, which is, very wishful thinking. Part of what my questions are going to be today is the model that we're setting up going to be able to work well when only 2,000 families are looking for help? And what happens to the model when 50,000 families need help? Is the model that we're building going to be able to surge to the levels necessary to do the job, a standardized minimum but adequate job that is required? Another thing that struck me was from the GAO report. It said the 5 most reported needs among the clients were housing, furniture, health and well-being, utilities, and food. I'm very interested to see that jobs was not on here. I would have thought with 240,000 people out of work that one of the things that people might be scrambling the most for would be employment. So I'm interested to note from GAO why that didn't come up more. Maybe it did in a different way. I mean, obviously housing should be first because, Fred, that's what people were scrambling the most for is shelter. And so those are just some of the observations I wanted to point out, and let me get to my questions, and I'll start with those. Let's talk about, with the panelists, about the model that you're developing. First of all, Ms. Zimmerman, do you have intention to have HUD a party to this agreement, or is this something that you all are doing just with Health and Human Services? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
The current agreement...
You have to press your button.
Sure. The current agreement is between us and Health and Human Services. We recognize our partners with HUD through the programs that we've used to date. One of the initiatives that's going on right now is the Long-Term Disaster Recovery Working Group that's been established through the White House, which is in conjunction with the Secretaries for HUD and the Secretary for Homeland Security. So as we're moving forward with that, that's looking at disaster recovery on the broader scale and the abilities that we have today versus where we want to take disaster recovery in the future. So I believe one of the outcomes from that working group and our recommendations in our report will be to incorporate all of the partners who has a piece of the case management and what that program should look like going forward.
And what is your view on that, Mr. Tombar?
I too reference the work that the 2 agencies are heading in concert with actually all of the agencies across the federal government with a long-term disaster recovery working group. I believe that out of that we'll certainly see a recommendation to the President that in fact there needs to be better coordination across the federal government in a way that we provide services for recovery and relief to families impacted by disasters.
Right, and I think that all you really need to make that point is this particular chart, if I can find it, the one that says the thing that people needed most was housing. I mean, when you're managing cases for families, I don't know what I did with mine, but it's around here. It was... they needed housing, I think, was the number one, there it is, the number one chart. And then furniture, health and well-being, utilities, and food. So we should keep that in mind. The other question that came to mind, just thinking about regular work in regular times, how communities and how families navigate among agencies to try to help them without disasters in mind, just normal days. They call a service 211, you know, it's like 911, but there's a 211 service that we're trying to develop. I've been helpful in trying to start that up and fund it in many places around the country. They also go, I think public health units sometimes have particular outreach in urban areas, would be rural extension services in rural areas. A lot of families will call up rural extension and say, I need this help or I need that. They might call public health offices, and they most certainly, at a volunteer level, non-government, 211 is something that I think communities are getting used to. How are we incorporating the bone structure that's already there before we build? You know, are we building on that? Are we paralleling some of their work? Are we using them in some case management? Or is that just a reference? Is 211 just a referral service? It's not really a case management, it's referral. But could that be used in any way as we build this system? Does anybody want to comment? Mr. Hansel?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we learned from the early part of our pilot, our post-Gustav pilot, was that having a single toll-free call-in line for access to services responded to the concern, Chairwoman, that you mentioned earlier of people not having a direct place to go to get access to the service. What we would intend to do in the future is where resources like 211 or existing phone lines like that exist, to build on and collaborate with those rather than to create something new. They don't exist in every state, they don't exist in every part of the state, but we certainly would agree that where they do exist, we would want to partner with them in building on an existing capability.
Mm-hmm. And I just think that would be a smart approach to survey what exists in the 50 states now and in the counties, measuring that against the counties or parishes, in our case, most at risk. You know, you can just overlay that risk map pretty easily over the assets, and when you're building a national model, build it at least on some of the things that are already there. Would be, and let me correct myself because I want to give credit where credit's due. The bar graphs are from the report on Katrina aid today by the national service provider, which in this case was the United Methodist Committee, so we thank them for this information, and then the timeline, of course, was presented by GAO. Let me ask a couple of other questions of the panel. This would be both for ACF and FEMA. Catholic Charities was awarded a 5-year nationwide case management contract as part of the task order, which has not yet been funded. Catholic Charities required to pre-identify local regional volunteers, subcontractors, to be ready to deploy within 72 hours. Can you elaborate on the department's plan for funding this contract and near-term tasks to develop a national team, and have you all identified funds to implement this contract?
Yes, that's our contract, so I should probably respond to that. We are awaiting the approval of our fiscal year 2010 budget for this service for disaster case management to fund that contract. We are, like much of the government, we're operating under continuing resolution right now, so we don't have access to.
And what is in the budget? I mean, what is in the appropriation?
The President requested $2 million, the bulk of which would be used to fund the contract. We designed the contract to respond to a number of the things that we learned from our initial evaluation, as I mentioned, particularly the problem of difficulty in finding and recruiting enough qualified case managers, especially in a quick response to a surge in need. So the contract will fund Catholic Charities USA both to be prepared to provide disaster case management services in the event of a future major disaster, but also to pre-identify and pre-certify case managers so that they'll be ready and available when a disaster strikes.
And I understand this was a competitive bid. Can you just care to talk about one or two other or three other organizations that competed? Catholic Charities was chosen, but are there others?
There were several bidders. Catholic Charities was chosen. We can provide you with a list of the bidders if you'd like. We'd be happy to do that. But it was an open competitive process, open to any bidder that was interested.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Let me see. Let's talk about the privacy issue for just a minute, because this continues to come up in our review. Does anybody want to comment about the current privacy issue and why it's in place. Is it necessary? Are there modifications that we could look to so that we can better serve the individuals that we're trying to serve? And again, in disasters, these can be very poor individuals who have been a part of some kind of government help and assistance through either Medicaid or housing, health care, job placement. It can be middle-class families who have never been a part of any kind of government support system and are unfamiliar with how to navigate. So let's talk about the privacy issue. I don't know who wants to start, Ms. Zimmerman perhaps, and I'd really like to hear from you, Ms. Guma, on this.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First off, the number one thing for FEMA is to protect the privacy rights of the individuals, the disaster survivors. But through this process, we know that we need to provide information to the service providers for the disaster case management. So it's my understanding we now have a better process in place so that when an agency requests the information, we're able to provide, working with the state and the local provider to get that information that they need to be able to service the applicants when they come in.
But can you articulate for me the reason that we would have to keep FEMA records private? Is it we're trying to protect them from what? From being exploited by people trying to help them, or exploited by unscrupulous salespeople, or what are we protecting?
The latter of that. We gather a lot of information when we're putting people into our database to assist them through our programs of individual assistance, Social Security numbers, a lot of personal information. Not all that information is needed when it goes forward to the other providers for case management. So we are able to release that other information, the names, the addresses, the phone numbers, and that. So we do have a process in place to do that. Mm-hmm. So I believe that has improved over time.
Because I most certainly can understand keeping Social Security numbers, banking information, private, but sort of names, number of children in the household, previous employment, if the father was a welder, that might be helpful for the case manager to know because she's looking for a job, and what was his previous employment. Things that would be helpful to help people. Ms. Guma, do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, I do, and I want to first acknowledge that we have made tremendous progress with both FEMA and HUD in this regard. Having said that, we have gone down a very, very difficult journey to share information, and when we started the process of requesting information both on households living in trailers and households in the DHAP program, even the process of getting aggregate data, which not even client level with any identifying information, in the initial phases was a struggle. We have, again, made leaps and bounds in information sharing, and it now flows much more easily. I guess one of our concerns, just speaking back to one of our recommendations, is that that process really does need to be institutionalized. It is wonderful that we have great partners now at the table with us who work really well. We can make requests and get the information so quickly, and we tremendously appreciate that. But our concern is that, in a new place, on a new day, at a new time, it would perhaps be a different scenario for that government body seeking that information. So we do think it's important. We also encountered a challenge with FEMA and HUD where there was not clarity about who was allowed to give us data. So I think that's been something that's been worked out, but when we have sought data in the past from HUD, there's been some confusion about who had the authority to release it, and I do think we've made progress on that front, but it was a big challenge for us for a very long time.
Go ahead.
If I may. Ms. Guma is right that there was a challenge with providing the data, and the data that the state was requesting was full access to all data that we had, because they wanted to know as much as they possibly could about the families, and it made sense to be able to provide the comprehensive type of case management that you reference. what we learned was that the Privacy Act prohibited HUD from being able to provide that data because we did not have the type of arrangements and agreements and approvals through the systems of record for those data to be able to provide that to the state. But in the conversation with Ms. Zimmerman and others over at DHS, we found that FEMA did in fact have ongoing agreements with the state, and therefore was able to simply, by not making the request for the same data to HUD, but simply to FEMA, that FEMA could provide the data. And in fact, I'm pleased to announce that for DHAP Ike, where the state of Louisiana has made a request for data that was provided to them on behalf of families in DHAP Katrina, just today on a conference call with jointly with HUD, FEMA, and the state of Louisiana, we think that we've been able to resolve that issue so that those data will be able to flow forward to the state at some time soon.
Well, I just urge you all to stay focused on finding the right solution to this issue so that we are treating people as quickly as we can, helping them with dignity. People want help. They don't want to fill out multiple forms, giving their name, their Social Security information multiple times to different agencies because the law doesn't allow the agencies to talk with each other. Now, there's a reason why some personal data should be presented. But when you're trying to help, it's imperative that local officials and local entities, the nonprofits, the state, the parishes, particularly because those locals are in some ways held accountable for the outcomes, so that the federal government looks down on the city of New Orleans and would say, why do you have 10,000 homeless people still? It's a good question to the city. Well, if the city says we don't even have information about these people because we can't get it other than a door-to-door daily survey, then that's a real issue. And I'm sure that is true across other places in the Gulf Coast. Let me do one or two more questions, then we're going to move to the second the second panel. This duplication of benefits issue, it's my understanding that public housing authorities at state and local levels consider themselves to be caseworkers, which required the Mississippi Case Management Consortium to close cases with other voluntary agencies to avoid duplication of benefits. Could you comment about this? I guess it's Fred under, Tombor under HUD. What are the public housing agencies? Will they continue to provide case management? Will this be continue to be judged as a duplication of services, which is in the FEMA law against the law to provide two services, I think, to the same person? Is that the situation? Does anybody want to comment or know anything about that? Did GAO look into that at all?
I think we went only as far as looking at the fact that there were, stops and starts and multiple service providers at the same time. We didn't look to see whether there should be.
The content of the services provided or the quality of the services provided.
We would have loved to have looked at the quality of the services provided, but I think the information just wasn't there for us to make a judgment on that.
The duplication of benefits is sort of a term of art that has multiple meanings, and you know about it well in the context of the Road Home program and our community development block grant program, and how
Small
so I was
business
a little bit
program.
confused with it being used in this context. But my understanding is that what is at issue here is that there were agreements with one of the groups that you have testifying on the next panel, MCMC, to provide services on behalf of some 400 families initially. Those were families who subsequently became a part of the DHAP program and were serviced by PHAs in terms of public housing authorities in terms of the payments that were being made on their behalf. And so what we didn't want was precisely the thing that you were critical of here, was that we had multiple service providers providing services on behalf, the same services on behalf of families. And so that was the issue, was that to not have the public housing agencies duplicate services that were already being provided by an already contracted service provider.
Okay. Well, I'll ask the Mississippi folks to clarify that, but let me ask this final question because I really want to get this clear with you all because it's important, I think, for those trying to create a better system. The National Disaster Housing Strategy calls for HUD to continue providing case management services. But if FEMA and HHS have an agreement, there still is confusion among the at-large community about which agency is in charge, and so can you comment about who's the lead here on case management? Who should people be talking to? Is it FEMA? Is it Health and Human Services? Or is it HUD?
I will start that one. As of right now, FEMA has the authority and the laws to do disaster case management. With our agreement that we have right now with ACF, we have that ability to get them on the road within 72 hours to do disaster case management. And as we're moving forward to put together the permanent program, this is our interim program, then we will take that and take the lessons that we've learned and put together the program so it's comprehensive and it covers all aspects of it. So right now, a state, if they get declared for a disaster and need disaster case management assistance, they would apply to FEMA for assistance, and we would institute the program as it is today.
Okay, well, I, for one, would urge you to work as quickly as you can to reach out to HUD, which is an obvious agency that needs to be included. And if you think about particular populations, the Justice Department may be another one in terms of case management. When you think about the families and the status of family members, whether they were in prison when this happened, if they're on probation when this happens, for either juvenile cases or adult cases. In some of these communities and in states, it's thousands and thousands of people that may be affected. So you know, we haven't even looked at the coordination that's required with the Department of Justice, but definitely with HUD, given that in case management we're learning that what most families needed was permanent housing so that they could sort of reestablish themselves, get into a church or a synagogue, get into a school, get into a job, and stabilize themselves until they could figure out when they could get back into their original community. All right, thank you all very much. I'm going to have to move to the next panel. As the next panel's coming up, just to save time, I'm going to go ahead and do brief introductions. And again, thank you all very much. We have first Reverend Larry Snyder, our first witness, who oversees Catholic Charities USA work to reduce poverty in America. Reverend Schneider will discuss the Catholic Charities experiences under Katrina aid today and their work on the ACF model for disaster case management that was utilized after Gustav and Ike. Next, we have Diane Roth-Smith, is the Executive Director of the National Volunteer Organization Active in Disasters. NVOAD is the forum through which nonprofit relief organizations share knowledge and resources. She will discuss their proposal to improve case management guidelines and program. Dr. Erwin Redliner is president and co-founder of the Children's Health Fund. Dr. Redliner has testified before this subcommittee many times. We're happy to see him again. And he has some information for us on his view of case management. Stephen Carr is a program director for Mississippi Case Management Consortium. He's also a consultant to ABT Associates, for which he contributed extensively to design and writing of the ACF HHS model that we've just talked about. And finally, Dr. Montique Sizer, his President and Chief Executive Officer of Louisiana Family Recovery Corps. He will discuss the Louisiana Family Recovery Corps disaster case management work after Katrina and Rita and the need to develop long-term human recovery plans at the federal level. I look forward to all of your testimony, and thank you, Reverend. We'll begin with you. I have several, and unfortunately we're only going to have another 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm going to have to close the hearing slightly early. But let me begin with you, Doctor, and also with you, Ms. Roth-Smith. You know, this chart, I tell my staff I love charts because when you put them out in the right way, it's so clear and you just can't fudge it. And when you look at this chart, there were 2 entities in the entire country that stood up to help people as the federal government just didn't have any case management in place. And that was, according to this, Katrina Aid Today, which stood up in December of '05. And you all did that by marshaling the resources of the 30 or so largest nonprofits in the country and put your good resources together and built a model where there was none. And then because I remember when this was done, under the extraordinary work of Governor Blanco, in the face of having nothing offered in this particular area, stood up the Louisiana Family Recovery Corps, primarily with state funding, as I recall. Do you remember how much the initial funding the state put up? Do you know how much it was?
Through Department of Social Services, is about $22 or $26 million.
Put up $26 million toward this effort. So I'm going to really rely on you two, your 2 efforts, to really give some good information about the early days, because you all were there, you know, what people really needed in the very early days. I'm extremely impressed with what Mississippi has done as well. Although you all came in later, your work, from what I can tell and from your passionate testimony, has really added a tremendous amount to this debate as we shape this program that is going to have to work, you know, much better, much more quickly, much more comprehensively. So let me ask you, Ms. Smith, how should we define when a case should be closed, or maybe I should say, how do we define success when we're dealing with families, or how did you all define success so that you could report to your own donors a proper evaluation of the work that you did? How would you explain this definition and these conclusions to your donors or contributors?
Sure. It's our definition of success, or what we define as recovered, is completely determined based upon the local community and the needs of the individual and client and family. So the term recovered is determined between the client, his or her family, and the case manager that's working with them.
What they asked for, if they walked in and said, we need a refrigerator, you got them one, that was success?
Yes.
Okay. If they walked in and said, we need an apartment, you got it for them, that was success?
Yes. A recovery plan is developed right in the beginning between the client and the case manager, and then the process by which that it's achieved is what determines success.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Mr. Sizer? How did you all frame your success or your goals when you started the program?
Yes, ma'am. We determine it in 3 ways. Namely, clients who come in and identify what it is they believe based on an assessment, what their needs are. Second to that, we also place accountabilities on agencies in which we work with to ensure that they help the clients meet their objectives. And thirdly, we determine success by what clients actually contributed towards their own success. Because oftentimes it takes some creative initiative on behalf of people who have been impacted to also do some things in which they, especially if they're able to help move things in accordance to their desired goals and aims. And so it's what individual families bring to the table, is what the case management provider does on behalf, and also what those 3 entities do in conjunction towards the success of an identified plan that's done between a family and the case management. And
Mr. Carr, let me ask you, how did you all, when you started your program, or how do you currently define success?
Sure. I want to clarify one thing, and that is that the Katrina Aid Today model had a presence in Mississippi throughout its tenure.
And they have presence in all the states, I think.
Correct. We had 5 affiliate agencies in Mississippi throughout the length of its operation. I began as program director for MCMC during phase 1, and then continues on to phase 2. So there has not been a break in case management activity in Mississippi. What I will say is that as time goes on, the case management has gotten better. We've done a better job because we're able to focus locally. The height of Katrina today, we had somewhere around 50 case managers in Mississippi. At the beginning of phase 1 for the MCMC, we had almost 300 because the need was there and we were able to document the need and be able to procure funds. We define success based on the recovery plan. We use a holistic model. For me, and what we teach in our training is that once a client is self-determined, that is a good indication of recovery. When that client is able to access resources and services on his or her own, that is a point at which case managers should consider that case for closure. When they don't need us to take them or advocate for them to HUD or for a voucher or for a refrigerator or for an apartment, when they show signs that they're able to function in that arena on their own, that's what we call self-determination. And that's when we look at case closure. And we leave the client with a recovery plan that they use as a roadmap well beyond our involvement with that case.
Okay, we've covered this in the first panel, but I'd like your individual impressions on this privacy issue and just some a brief suggestion as to how we might approach it. I don't know, maybe starting, I don't know, Reverend, if you have something you want to add on this privacy issue, but anyone that wants to speak to it, because we've got to solve this as we move forward. Does anybody have a suggestion about how it could be done or something we should look to? Would anybody like to, Ms. Smith, would you like to comment or Reverend?
I do not have a suggestion to show how we could actually solve that, other than to say that, in fact, I mean, it is something that's very critical and that we do need to find a way to be more effective with how we do that. But I do not personally have a suggestion.
I don't have a suggestion for the federal family, but the way it's resolved through the voluntary agencies is usually through a technology solution called the Coordinated Assistance Network. And it's a way that the voluntary agencies provide information to one another about a client and the family through shared mechanism, so that the duplication is diminished, but also the need for the client to share that information again and again as well.
Senator Landrieu, if I could add, the sharing of a FEMA number is critical for deduplicating effort. In the state of Mississippi, when we were asked to set up phase 1, we requested data from FEMA. We got names, addresses, telephone numbers. We didn't get FEMA numbers. Identifying information such as that is critical for us. We requested information from our affiliates. We got 17,000 names. Compared that to the information that we got from FEMA, 5,000 names. You know how many John Smiths there are in the state of Mississippi? And a lot of them we got that didn't have phone numbers or addresses. A key identifier, a FEMA number, is critical for especially contractors. So for me, a suggestion is that once FEMA or HHS or HUD enters into a contractual agreement with a service provider, that they give that information to that contractor, and then it's our responsibility to hold that information confidential, not sell FEMA numbers, et cetera. But when we're not given the trust to handle information in a way that helps us serve clients more efficiently, quite frankly, it's irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask Father, if I could, because you all have the contract for responding now, Catholic Charities does, and if this issue of privacy is not worked out, not sure how effective that next, response will be, number one. But also a different subject is in your contract or in your thoughts to provide this service to the federal government, how do you protect against secondhand trauma to case managers? Because in some instances, when the situations are very difficult, we found that some of the people that needed the most help after the first couple of weeks or months were the first responders themselves, the nurses who just collapsed, or the caseworkers that just couldn't take it anymore. So how are we thinking about how to deal with that in this whole, response case management to the case managers?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent point. And I guess I would go back to what our experience was after Katrina and Rita, in that fortunately we did have a large network of case managers to draw upon, and many of them came throughout the country to Baton Rouge or to New Orleans, to Biloxi. An agency would send, Albany, New York, for example, sent 4 or 5 people on a rotating basis for 6 months to to Baton Rouge, which allowed the local folks who were dealing with their own trauma to have that time, that space. I look back at the days just beyond Katrina and how the folks who themselves were affected also could not help themselves from working and reaching out. And until they knew there was someone else who was qualified to come in and take their place and give them the space, they wouldn't rest. So I think that is something that we have to make sure is there. We also had some mental health services that we brought in for whole agencies that would deal with case managers. They would take a day and just, 1 day a month to try to address that. So I agree with you that that's a critical piece to help prevent that burnout.
And Dr. Radlander, do you want to comment about that at all? I know your focus has been children, but it's also been mental health.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to comment about the previous question, if I might also, Senator.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this issue about the privacy is extraordinarily important. We face this all the time in medical practice as well, obviously. And I think the key, there's 3 steps really that I would suggest. One is that we really have to have the concept ingrained of a one-stop shop for federal services. That means that you enter the system and you enter then the service purview of any major agency of the federal government that you might need. And secondly, along with that, we go the standardized database. So there's one time where people fill out the data forms and that's it, and that form is shared among people. But the third and critical step, I think, is to simply at intake, ask parents for permission to share data. That's the end of the privacy problem. All you have to do is you have to sign, obviously, an appropriate form that's readable, that's explained to families. It says, in order to help you, we'd like to be able to share your information with relevant agencies. These are the safeguards. 99.9% of families will sign it, and to me, that's a very simple solution to what otherwise is a very complex problem that would require law changes and regulations and all sorts of things that might be very long in coming. So I would just recommend that.
Okay. I've got to unfortunately end, but I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds. If there's something I didn't cover, something you want to mention, this would be the time to do it. We'll start with you, Dr. Sizer.
Again, thanks, Chairman Landrieu, for the opportunity. I'll just mention the issue of reintegration. Many of our citizens were deported to other parts of the country and have yet to return. And I think trying to find a way in which to identify those individuals and bring them back home and help them get reestablished will be critically important. The second issue I'll raise is the issue of cultural competence. I certainly welcome the national model of descending on the state, especially when there's a catastrophic event. But I'll also make mention that understanding the local players and what transpires and what takes place is critically important, because you could have well-meaning efforts and have unintended negative consequences. So those are the other 2 points I'd like to raise.
Thank you. Dr. Carr, Mr. Carr.
Senator Landrieu, wanted to circle back to the question that was raised with HUD about duplication of benefits. I use the term duplication of effort because that's what we're trying to prevent. And the issue that you raised was, I believe, in my written testimony where I talked about silos. Whatever we can do to prevent silo behavior, either within an agency or within federal programs altogether, the better off we are. The issue of one case manager per program is an example of HUD having DHAP case managers, FEMA having MCMC case managers, and others trying to serve the same client. We
need one case manager per family.
Per family that has access to all resources, correct. So that was the issue, that whatever we can do to prevent silos, families benefit. We have a consistent, systematic structure, and that is what is needed most in order to be cost-effective and most impactful on the families that we're serving. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Redland.
A cautionary note about defining when a case is closed, because it's a very dynamic situation, and I wouldn't necessarily depend on a decision made between a family and a case manager at point X, that X plus 6 months, the situation will be the same. And what we're learning from this prolonged dislocation and recovery is that the definition is clear. You need a stable, safe home, you need access to essential services, schools and health care, and you need some way of getting into a livelihood, returning to a livelihood. And those should be the criteria. Those are objective criteria that could be combined with a family's understanding of what they think they need. But if they don't have stability and structure, even if today they say things are fine, we don't need you, we already got the refrigerator, 6 months from now you could have a family struggling with horrible problems of poor access to health care, academic failure, and a lot of other stress, and mental and emotional health issues that will need to be taken care of down the road. So I think we should be very clear about what we mean by a reestablished, renormalized situation for families.
Thank you. Ms. Ross-Smith?
I want to highlight a comment that Reverend Snyder illustrated earlier, and that is that while Katrina Aid Today started in December 2005, the organizations that were part of that used a model that had been in existence for quite a long time. And the organizations like Catholic Charities USA, UMCOR, Lutheran Disaster Response, and the American Red Cross, and others have been providing disaster case management for decades. So I would strongly encourage to really look and to continue to look to them as the experts that have been doing this work and will continue to do this work regardless of the models that come out.
Thank you very much. Father?
Thank you. And I've already talked about my concern for the funding of a national infrastructure, but so I guess I would like to end with saying that let's not lose sight of the need for flexibility, that even though we're saying 18 months of case management should be enough, in some cases it's not. And I know our local providers right now who are working on Gustav and Ike have written a letter and I think made a good case in the fact that because case management did start a little later, whatever, that it still might need a little more time. So just, again, the need for flexibility in whatever services we're trying to provide.
Okay, I really want to thank our FEMA director for staying, for the HUD director for staying and listening to the testimony, and we really appreciate the way these agencies are really leaning forward, you know, to work better and faster with all the other pressures that the administration and Congress has before it. But this committee, as you know, our subcommittee is focused on staying on the job until the job is done, to get better laws in place, better procedures in place, a better overall response. And in that, I'll announce I'll be sending several staffers to the international conference. I myself can't attend, but we'll be sending several staffers, and we'll ask the administration to send people to the conference in Kobe, Japan, which will be hosting an international conference on this and other subjects related to recoveries from disasters. That city will be celebrating its 15th year of recovery from a great earthquake. So there'll be high-level individuals, elected officials, community leaders, I'm assuming from all over the world. And so what we're doing here is going to help frame what we do in the United States, but we're hoping to share that information, of course, internationally to help victims of major disasters everywhere. So we thank you for your testimony, and we'll put it to good use. The meeting is adjourned.